The morning Vera Langston said the words, "Please, don't hit me. I'm already in pain," to a complete stranger in a hospital corridor, she was not talking about her legs. She hadn't talked about her legs in months. That's the thing about losses that arrive wrapped inside other losses, layered and stacked the way freight piles on a broken shelf. You stop accounting for individual pieces. You just feel the total weight pressing down all the time, even in your sleep. And if you're the kind of woman who has spent 2 decades building an empire on the principle that weakness is a liability you cannot afford, well, you become very, very good at not talking about the weight at all. Vera Langston had been one of the most discussed commercial real estate developers in the Midwest for the better part of a decade. Langston Developments had her name on it, literally in brushed steel letters on the 41st floor of a building on North Michigan Avenue. And at 44 years old, she had spent 20 years building it from a 3-person office in a rented strip mall in Oak Park, Illinois, into a company with over $200 million in active holdings across 6 states. She had survived brutal markets. She had survived a recession that swallowed firms twice her size. She had survived the particular grinding brand of condescension that the commercial real estate industry never fully bothered to hide from women who refused to shrink. She had survived every quarterly report, every zoning war, every negotiation where the man across the table had assumed that because she was precise and composed and well-dressed, she could be managed. She had survived all of it. What she had not survived, not yet, not fully, was October 14th. That was the night the drunk driver ran the red light at the intersection of Wacker and Monroe at 11:17 in the evening. It was a Tuesday. Vera and her husband Robert had just left the dinner celebrating their firm's 20th anniversary. Robert had ordered the champagne himself, a specific bottle he'd been planning for weeks. He'd made a toast. He'd held her hand across the table and said something that made her laugh until her eyes watered, and she could not remember the exact words anymore no matter how hard she tried. And that forgetting, that specific, daily, unrecoverable forgetting, was its own species of cruelty that lived alongside everything else. The impact came from the passenger side. Robert Langston died at the scene. Vera survived with 3 broken ribs, a fractured clavicle, and a spinal cord injury that the doctors described with the careful, measured language of people trained to deliver hard things, which she translated alone in a private hospital room at 3 in the morning as, "Your legs are not coming back." Not the way they were. Not for running. Not for the mornings when she used to hit the lakefront path before the city was awake, angry at the pavement the way Robert always said she was, channeling every current of her life into the simple physics of forward motion. That had been 6 months ago. Now, she was at Lakeside Rehabilitation Center in Chicago's near North Side, 3 sessions a week, where a physical therapist named Sandra worked her through exercises that felt like being asked to move a mountain with a toothpick. Vera arrived every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. She was never late. She never cried during the sessions. Not once, not where anyone could see. She wore her blazers even here, even at physical therapy. Her executive assistant Patricia had learned not to comment on this. The chair was a titanium lightweight model, custom fitted. Vera had done the research herself from her hospital bed, the same week she'd been told about the spinal injury. If she was going to be in it, it was going to be a good one. She did not think of this as resilience. She thought of it as the only available option. That morning in January, the morning this story really begins, she arrived at Lakeside 12 minutes early and sat in the main waiting area while Patricia took a call outside. The room smelled like industrial cleaner and something faintly floral that couldn't quite decide what it was trying to be. The chairs were upholstered in a gray-blue fabric that hadn't been fashionable since 2009. A television in the corner ran the Weather Channel at low volume. A plastic plant on a side table had been there so long it had collected a thin layer of dust on each leaf, as if even the fake version of something living had gotten tired. And across the room, sitting with both feet flat on the floor and her hands folded neatly in her lap, like she was waiting for something she had been waiting for her whole small life, was a little girl. She looked about 8. Red hair pulled into a slightly lopsided ponytail. A spray of freckles across the bridge of a snub nose. She was wearing a purple jacket with a broken zipper. The kind of kid wears because it's warm, not because it goes with anything. And she was reading a book that was clearly written for someone at least 10 years older than her. Vera couldn't make out the title from where she sat, but the child's brow was furrowed with the specific, concentrated effort of a person who refuses to be defeated by something. Vera recognized that expression. She'd worn it for most of her adult life. She almost looked away. She usually looked away from children these days. It was easier than the alternative. But the girl glanced up at exactly the wrong moment, or the right one, and caught Vera staring. And instead of looking away with the embarrassed reflex of a child who'd been caught, she held Vera's gaze with complete calm and said, "You have really good posture for someone in a wheelchair." Vera blinked. "I'm Penny," the girl said. "Vera. That's kind of an old-fashioned name." Penny considered this without apology. "My grandma was named Vera, but she was really cool, so it's a compliment." "Is she still alive?" "No." Penny glanced at her book, then back up. "But she would have liked you. She had good posture too." Something in the left corner of Vera Langston's mouth did an involuntary thing just then. Not quite a smile. The ghost of one. She hadn't felt that particular ghost in months. "What are you here for?" Penny asked. "Physical therapy." "Me too." She held up her hands, and Vera saw it then. The slight swelling at the knuckles, the way the fingers weren't perfectly straight, the small, visible story of a body fighting itself from the inside. JRA. Juvenile rheumatoid arthritis. "My joints get angry at me sometimes." She said it the way children say things that would cost an adult 3 sessions of therapy to voice without flinching, simply and directly, as if the fact of it didn't require any particular management. "It's not bad right now. It was worse last week." "I'm sorry," Vera said. She meant it. She was not a person who said things she didn't mean. That particular habit had served her well in 2 decades of real estate and did not stop serving her now. "It's okay. My dad says the pain doesn't get to win." Penny tilted her head. "Does yours hurt? Your legs?" Vera looked down at the chair, then back at the child in the purple jacket. "Not anymore." Penny nodded slowly, with the gravity of someone absorbing information and filing it carefully. "That's sad," she said, "but also kind of peaceful, right?" Vera opened her mouth and found that she had nothing to say. Because Penny Dunbar, 8 years old, with a broken zipper jacket and a book above her reading level, had just said the one thing in 6 months that was exactly, precisely, and uncomfortably true. She hadn't told her therapist that. She hadn't told Patricia. She hadn't told herself in those words. But yes, there was a quietness to the numb. Alongside the grief and the rage and the machinery of daily survival, there lived a terrible, guilty peace where the pain used to be. She didn't answer, but she didn't look away either. And that was the beginning. Here's what you need to know about the man who was about to walk through that door. Holt Dunbar was 38 years old, 6 feet 1, and carrying the particular kind of tired that doesn't come from a bad night's sleep. It comes from years of holding everything together by yourself, quietly, without an audience, without the option of putting it down. It settles into the lines around the eyes and the set of the jaw and the way a person moves through a room. Purposeful, unhurried, like someone who learned a long time ago that making noise doesn't make things happen any faster. He worked as a structural engineer for a mid-sized Chicago firm. His job, in the simplest terms, was to look at buildings other people had constructed and find where the foundations were compromised before the walls gave way. He was exceptionally good at it. His colleagues called him methodical. His managers called him invaluable. His daughter called him dad, and that was the one that mattered. He had been raising Penny alone since she was 3, when her mother Tessa, 29 years old, 2 years into their marriage, the funniest person Holt had ever known, died of ovarian cancer over the course of 9 months that went from a routine checkup to a funeral in a time frame that still, 5 years later, did not feel possible. The math of that loss had never gotten easier. It had just become part of the structure. One more load he redistributed quietly across every other weight-bearing point of his life. Penny's diagnosis came 2 years after Tessa. Holt had taken her to 3 appointments before he allowed himself to process what the rheumatologist was saying. His system, developed over years of solo parenting, was feel it, file it, get back to work. He had sat in the parking lot of a Walgreens for 22 minutes after that 3rd appointment before he felt the full weight of it, and then he drove home and made spaghetti, Tessa's recipe, and told Penny that her joints were going to need some extra attention and that they were going to figure it out together, which they were. Lakeside Rehabilitation Center was Penny's 3rd PT facility. They had been here 6 months. Penny's right hand inflammation had been more stable than it had been in 2 years under Sandra's protocol, which was all Holt needed to know to keep driving her here 3 mornings a week, signing her in at the front desk, and sitting in the gray-blue waiting room with his book and his bad coffee for 40 minutes while his daughter fought her own quiet battle down the hall. He came in that January morning to find Penny already installed across the room, deep in conversation with someone. Penny talked to everyone. This was not new. He started across to the check-in desk, and then he saw the woman in the titanium wheelchair and something, not recognition exactly, but the precursor to it, the specific mental snag of a face that belongs to a category, caught in mid-step. He recovered. He went to the desk. He signed in. He sat down 2 seats from his daughter. "Is this your dad?" the woman asked Penny. "That's him," Penny said, not looking up. He nodded. "Holt Dunbar." She said her name was Vera. No last name offered. He didn't ask for one. He picked up his book. She looked at her phone. Sandra came for Penny at 8:15, and Penny stood, handed the woman her book. "You can look at it while I'm in there. I can tell you on it," and disappeared down the hallway. Vera held the book in her lap. She didn't open it. Holt looked at his own book and did not read a word. He knew exactly where he'd seen her face. Chicago Business Magazine, 2 years ago, cover story. Vera Langston and the company she built. He had read that article 3 times, not for admiration, but because he had been building a picture, carefully, over 3 years since his father's death, of the company his father had helped create and never fully received credit for. He thought about his father. He set the book on his knee and looked at the wall. He had not planned on the waiting room. He had not planned on Penny chatting with the CEO of Langston Developments as if they were 2 people with time to spare. He had not planned on any of this being human. But you need to know something important. Because the story you think you're watching, man with a grudge, CEO on a wheelchair, a collision of competing agendas, is not the story that's actually happening. There's a third party moving in the background of this whole picture who has plans for Vera Langston that she hasn't yet been allowed to see. And his name is Gil Hartwell. Stay with us. The first real friction between Vera and Holt happened on a Wednesday, 3 sessions in. Her wheelchair, precisely engineered, custom-fitted, caught its right front wheel in the gap between the elevator floor and the hallway tile as she came out of PT. The gap was barely half an inch, but half an inch is enough, and the relevant additional detail was that she was operating the chair through upper body pain from a new protocol Sandra had introduced that morning, and her grip and her focus were at about 60%, and the wheel caught anyway. She stopped, tried to reverse. The wheel held. She could feel the elevator doors beginning to close behind her. She reached back with one arm to hold them, which threw her balance, which made everything worse. And then there were hands at the back of the chair. Two of them, sure and unhurried, and the chair cleared the gap in one clean motion, and she was free. She spun around. Holt Dunbar stood there with his hands at his sides, car keys in one hand, a paper cup of coffee in the other. His expression was entirely neutral. "Don't," she said. "Don't what? Look at me like that." "Like what exactly?" "Like I needed to be rescued." Her voice was precise and cold, and she could hear that it was. She also couldn't fully stop it. This was the thing about pain that nobody ever said out loud. It wore you past the point of managing your own edges, past the point of being your best self for the people who didn't deserve the worst of you. "I had it." Holt tilted his head very slightly. "You had it," he said, testing the words with a tone that was not quite sarcasm, but was not quite not. "I could have used the door hold button." While holding the doors with your elbow and reversing the wheel at the same time. "Yes." He looked at her for a moment. He didn't apologize. He didn't get defensive. He didn't leave, which was the part that irritated her most. He just took a sip of his coffee and said, "Okay. Next time. That's all you have to say." "You're welcome," he said, and walked down the hall toward the waiting room. She sat in the corridor alone for 60 seconds. Maybe 90. The irritation and the humiliation and the uncomfortable kernel of knowing he had been correct sat in her chest in a tight, unresolvable cluster. She went with irritation. It was easier, but she thought about the exchange for the rest of the afternoon, and specifically about the way he'd said, "You're welcome," without wounded pride, without performance, without the passive bruising that most people brought to being rebuffed after an act of kindness. Just a flat, clean fact of it. She hadn't encountered that in a while. The people who helped Vera now, Patricia, the PT staff, the rotating, careful professionals in her life, did so with a specific quality of delicateness that said, "I know what you've been through, and I cannot bring myself to treat you entirely normally." She understood why. She hated it anyway, because careful, when sustained long enough, starts to feel like pity wearing a blazer. And pity was the one thing Vera Langston had never once asked for. Holt Dunbar had been neither careful nor cruel. He had simply told the truth. She didn't know what to do with that, so she thought about it instead. The following Monday, Penny was in the waiting room before Vera arrived, and she had brought a deck of cards. "Do you know how to play gin rummy?" she asked, before Vera had even fully pulled into the room from the door. "I haven't played since I was your age," Vera said. "Good," Penny said, pulling her chair around to face Vera's. "Then we're about even." They played 2 hands before Sandra came for Penny. Vera won the first. Penny won the second by a margin that was, Vera felt, a little too decisive for someone who claimed they were about even. "You've been practicing," Vera said. "My dad taught me last year." Penny gathered the cards without apology. "He says card games teach you how people think, whether they protect what they have or would try to build something. Which are you?" Penny thought about this seriously. "Both," she said, "depending on what I've got." She tucked the cards into her backpack. "What about you?" Vera looked at the door Sandra had just come through. "I used to think I was always building," she said. "I'm not sure anymore." Penny sipped ache. "Maybe you got so good at building that you forgot it was okay to also protect something." She stood. "That's what my dad says about foundations. You can't just keep going up. Eventually you have to hold." Vera sat in the waiting room after Penny disappeared down the hall and thought about the 8-year-old who had just casually delivered structural engineering as life advice, and about whether the person who'd taught her to think that way had been in the room the whole time. Meanwhile, on the 41st floor of the Langston Developments building on North Michigan Avenue, something was being quietly assembled that Vera had not yet been fully shown. Gil Hartwell had been the company's CFO for 11 years. 61 years old. Silver hair, precise suits, and the particular authority a man who had never publicly failed at anything, largely because he was always careful about which ship he stood on and when he left it. In the months since October 14th, while Vera had been fighting her way back through hospitals and PT centers, Gil had been running daily operations. She'd been kept informed, of course. She was nobody's passive anything, but there were gaps, inevitable ones, in those first raw months when the largest part of her was still trying to establish whether she intended to be in the world at all. Those gaps, as it turned out, had been used. Patricia came to Vera's apartment on a Thursday evening in late January, unannounced, with a manila folder and the face of someone who had rehearsed what they were about to say 3 times in the car on the way over. The board is calling an emergency session. 3 weeks from today. Vera set down her tea. For what? Gil has circulated a merger proposal. Pre-offer stage, but he's been building board consensus for at least 4 months. He has 7 of 12 votes already. Vera opened the folder. Grayfield Capital, a real estate investment trust out of Phoenix. She knew the name the way a doctor knows certain diagnoses, not because they like to think about them, but because you learn the patterns of things that do damage. Grayfield acquired companies the way certain organisms consumed hosts. They identified the profitable properties, liquidated the rest, restructured or eliminated leadership. 2 of the 3 firms they had absorbed in the last decade no longer existed by their original names. Her company, her name on the building. Robert South Loop Project, the blueprints he'd brought to their anniversary dinner, the thing he'd been most excited about in years. He doesn't have the votes without me, Vera said. Patricia was quiet for a beat too long. There's a complication. The complication, and you need to hold this very carefully because it is the thread that runs through everything, was a block of equity. Approximately 8% of Langston developments, sitting in a legal gray zone that dated back over 20 years. It had originated with a man named Frank Dunbar, who had been Robert Langston's original business partner in the early days of the company. Frank had been bought out in 2003, but the buyout agreement had contained a dormant equity clause, language that would reactivate Frank's interest if the company was ever sold or taken public. A technicality, some would say. A promise, Frank had said. He had died 3 years ago without ever seeing it honored. But his estate had filed notice, and his heir had not signed anything away. If that 8% activates during the merger process, Patricia said, and the heir votes against the deal combined with your stake, it blocks the acquisition. Just barely, but blocks it. Vera was very still. Who is the heir? Patricia glanced at the paper. A man named Holt Dunbar. Frank's son. Vera did not visibly react. She sat very quietly, and something behind her eyes went completely, carefully still, the way water goes still in a storm, right before everything starts to move. She told Patricia to call the attorneys. She closed the folder, and the next morning, she drove herself to Lakeside Rehabilitation Center, went through her PT session, and came out into the waiting room where Holt Dunbar was sitting with a coffee and a book, and she sat down across from him and did not yet understand that the thread connecting them had been there from the very beginning. He had brought 2 cups. He set one near her without a word. She looked at it. She picked it up. "Thank you," she said. "No problem." They sat in the easy silence that had begun to form between them over the previous weeks. Not empty silence, but the kind built by 2 people who do not need to fill space to justify their presence. "Penny is a remarkable kid," Vera said eventually. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile. The internal thing. Private pride that didn't need an audience. "Yeah," he said. "She is. She told me pain doesn't get to win. I tell her that." She started throwing it back at me. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. She noticed he did that when he was thinking. "Sometimes I'm the one who needs to hear it more." Vera looked at the hallway Penny had gone down. How does she stay like that? The lack of bitterness. He considered this the way he considered everything. Not quickly, not to fill the silence, but as if the question deserved a real answer. She doesn't hide what costs her. She'll tell you when it hurts, and then she moves on. He paused. I think hiding it is where bitterness lives. In the gap between what something costs and what you're willing to admit it costs. Vera looked at her coffee cup. What kind of structures do you build? She asked. Commercial mostly. Load-bearing analysis. Foundation assessments. He glanced at her sideways. I spent a lot of time looking at what's underneath things. Finding where the pressure is being absorbed wrong before it becomes a collapse. She held her cup in both hands. That sounds like useful work. When you catch the weak spot early, he said, you save the whole building. She didn't respond. But she held that sentence the way you hold something you don't have a pocket for yet. There is something you should know about why Holt hadn't said anything. And it matters because what you might assume, that he was playing a long game, running a slow approach on a wounded CEO, working the angle, is not what was actually happening. But what was happening in the background with Gil Hartwell would have made your stomach drop if you'd known about it then. Hold on to that. We're almost there. 2 weeks later, on a gray Saturday afternoon, Holt drove to Rose Hill Cemetery and walked to the grave of his father. Frank Dunbar's headstone was plain limestone. No flettisch, just the name, the dates, and beneath them, a single word Frank had chosen himself while he was still well enough to care about such things. Builder. Holt stood there for a while with his hands in his jacket pockets. I found her, he said to the stone. Vera Langstone. He looked at the dates on the granite. She's not what I expected her to be. He had known who Vera was from his first morning in that waiting room. He had done his research long before Penny's PT schedule had placed them in the same building. He had a folder. He had an attorney, a dormant equity specialist named Dale Frick, with a viable legal claim that had been sitting patiently waiting for the right moment. And he had the specific, complicated inheritance of being a man whose father had been cheated out of something real, but who had also watched his father refuse to become bitter about it for the last 20 years of his life. Frank Dunbar had never hated Robert Langston. He had been hurt. He had felt the betrayal of the 2003 buyout structure for the rest of his life. That quiet knowledge that the clause he'd agreed to in good faith had been designed to disappear. But he had also said, in those last months, more than once, Robert's wife didn't do this. She may not even know. Holt had taken that seriously, because Frank Dunbar had been a builder, and builders don't tear down. They find a flawed foundation and they correct it. She's trying, Holt said to the stone. She comes every Monday, Wednesday, Friday, in her chair, in her blazer, and she works. She doesn't ask anyone to feel sorry for her. He paused. She snapped at me in the elevator. She apologized for it with a cup of coffee. She didn't say she was apologizing, but I understood. The wind moved through the cemetery. A crow landed on a headstone 2 rows over and looked at him with a frank, unimpressed gaze of creatures that have watched humans do foolish things for a very long time. I'm going to tell her, Holt said, when the time is right. I'm going to tell her everything. What you built with Robert. What the clause says. What Hartwell has been trying to get me to sign away. He put his hand on the cold stone. I think she want to make it right, he said. I think that's who she is. He stayed until the light started to flatten toward evening. And then he drove home and put Penny to bed and sat at the kitchen table with a Frick file and a glass of water and thought about the architecture of the thing he was about to do, the way you think about load-bearing decisions. Carefully, with full knowledge of what might give way if you're wrong. What Holt didn't know that night, what he had no way of knowing, was that Gil Hartwell had already made his move. 3 days earlier, Hartwell had dispatched an attorney to locate Holt Dunbar with an offer, $2.3 million clean and fast, to sign a release on the dormant equity claim and make it go away before the board meeting. No activation. No complications. No Dunbar shares appearing at the wrong moment to block the Grayfield acquisition. 2.3 million. On a claim worth 17. Hartwell had calculated the number carefully. Generous enough to look like good faith. Small enough to bury the rest. He had not yet received Holt's answer. But the clock was running. The worst day came on a Friday. Sandra had introduced standing frame therapy, a protocol involving controlled weight-bearing pressure through Vera's lower body, the kind of approach that showed real promise for incomplete spinal injuries. The idea was to put Vera upright in a supported frame for extended intervals, to teach the body, through repetition and pressure, that it still occupied vertical space. In theory, manageable. In practice, the first full session broke something open. There is something about standing, about the memory of standing, of everything it once was to be upright and moving through the world under your own power, that cuts through in a way that lying on a table or sitting in a chair simply doesn't reach. Standing is where memory lives, where the ghost of your old body is most present, most loud. Vera then made it through. She came out into the PT hallway and sat against the wall in her chair with her eyes closed, and the wing was quiet because it was late Friday afternoon and the other patients were gone. She heard him before she saw him. Not footsteps, exactly, just the change in the quality of the air that tells you a room is no longer empty. She kept her eyes closed. Something was set on the floor near her wheel, a small paper bag, and then instead of a chair pulling up beside her, because there were chairs lined up along the wall, she heard the sound of someone lowering themselves to sit on the floor, so that they were at her level, so that neither of them was taller. She opened her eyes. Holt was sitting against the wall beside her wheel, legs stretched out, looking straight ahead. The paper bag was from the bakery on the ground floor. He had coffee. He offered neither comment nor comfort nor the careful, well-meaning weight of another person's sympathy. Bad one, he said. Don't ask me how I'm doing. The rawness in her voice surprised her. She tried to recalibrate. Please. I wasn't, he said. I was going to tell you that Penny got full range of motion back in her right index finger today. Took 4 months. She showed me by making a thumbs up and holding it 3 inches from my face for approximately 30 seconds. Vera opened her eyes wider. A thumbs up, she said. And she said, behold. She said, behold. She's been using it wrong for 2 weeks. Today was correct, and she knew it. Something cracked, just slightly, in the very architecture of Vera's composure. Not collapsed, just fractured. The kind of fracture that lets light in. I used to run, she said. She hadn't meant to say it. It came out anyway. He waited. Not competitively. I ran because I needed somewhere to put the extra current. She paused. Robert used to say, I ran like I was angry at the pavement. A sound that was almost a laugh, almost something else. He wasn't wrong. She looked at her hands. I would give a considerable amount to be angry at pavement again. Holt was quiet in the way that made room, not the way that asked her to stop. I stood in the frame for 40 minutes today, she said. And the whole time I felt like I was standing at Robert's funeral all over again, except I have to do it again Monday. She stopped. She had said more than she had said to anyone in 6 months. Maybe longer. I'm sorry, Holt said. Direct. No flinching. No pivot away from it. I don't want sorry in that at arm's length way, she said, where the sorrow is mostly about other people's discomfort. I know. That's not what I meant. I know it's not. She looked at the bag on the floor. What is that? Powdered sugar donut. They were out of glazed. She reached down and picked it up. She took a bite. Powdered sugar transferred to her lapel in a perfect, indiscriminate cloud. She looked down at it. She looked at him. He was very carefully looking at the wall. She could feel him not reacting the way you can feel a person holding their breath. Don't, she said. I'm not doing a thing. You're doing something. He lost the very small battle that was happening in the left corner of his mouth. She shook her head and took another bite and felt, quietly, carefully, like something she didn't want to acknowledge too directly in case it went away. Something approaching the specific, fragile weight of being a person who is still alive. How do you do it? She said. Do what? All of it. She turned the bag in her hands. Penny. The work. Be alone. She paused. You're not performing strength. There's no theater to it. I've been trying to understand how. He was quiet for a moment. Tessa, Penny's mom. She used to say that grief was just love with nowhere to go. He turned his coffee cup. I decided a long time ago that the nowhere was the problem, not the love. So I try to keep finding places to put it. Vera sat with that. Robert would have liked that, she said. Holt didn't respond to that, but he didn't look away either. They sat in the quiet corridor until Sandra came to lock up the wing, and she looked at the two of them, the woman in the titanium chair and the man on the floor beside her, with the expression of a person who has seen enough human pain to recognize when two pieces of it are accidentally keeping each other company. She said good night and left them to it. 2 days later, Gil Hartwell walked into Lakeside Rehabilitation Center. Vera saw him before he saw her. She was in the waiting room with Holt and Penny. Penny had brought a small magnetic chessboard or backpack and was walking Vera through a problem with the focused intensity of a person who had decided Vera needed educating. When the elevator opened and a man in a charcoal suit stepped out and scanned the room with a specific, locked-in look of someone who is not there for PT. She recognized Hartwell in an instant. He hadn't seen her yet. Her chair was angled, her head bent over the chessboard. And in that 2-second window, she watched him locate Holt with the particular focus of a man looking at something he needs to manage. He crossed the room, extended his hand. Mr. Dunbar. The voice carried precisely enough. I'm glad I caught you. Do you have a few minutes? She kept her eyes on the chessboard. Holt stood. Mr. Hartwell. The voice, neutral, not cold, not warm, and not at all surprised. They moved toward the far end of the room. Penny glanced at her father, then at Vera. Do you know him? Penny asked, quiet. He works with me. On a project. Vera kept her voice level. Penny studied Hartwell for a moment with the antennae of a child who has been reading complex books since she was 5 and has developed a correspondingly complex sensitivity to people. He has a sneaky face, she said. Vera did not disagree. She caught fragments across the waiting room. Before the board meeting, from Hartwell, and something lower from Holt that she couldn't catch, and then Hartwell again. The offer is more than fair given the uncertainty of the clause. Then Holt, even and unhurried, I'll be in touch. Hartwell left without once looking in Vera's direction. The elevator closed. Holt came back and sat down. Penny moved a rook and said, your turn. Who was that? Vera asked. Conversational. The voice she used in negotiations. Someone from work? Holt said. The same words she'd used to Penny, with the same careful weight of telling partial truth. He was not quite meeting her eyes. She made her chest move. She said nothing else. But that night, she called Patricia and said, pull everything you can find on a man named Holt Dunbar. A pause. I think I already know what you're going to find. The file came back in 48 hours. Structural engineer. 12 years at Keller and Associates. 42 commercial projects. Father, Frank Dunbar, deceased. Originally co-founder of what had become Langston Developments. Dormant equity claim filed 2 months after Frank's death through attorney Dale Frick. Status, unresolved. Current estimated value at activation, approximately $17 million. Vera read the report in her office at 11 at night. The city spread below her through floor-to-ceiling windows. $17 million. 8% of her company. 3 months of coffee. A donut. Payne doesn't get to win. A conversation on the floor of a PT hallway. She put the file down. She picked it up again. She read Holt's name at the top and felt the specific, lurching nausea of something that had felt real being suddenly rendered uncertain. The way a foundation feels when you discover a crack that changes the weight distribution of everything standing on top of it. She thought about the way he'd looked when Hartwell left the waiting room. Not guilty, not rattled, steady, but not surprised. She went to Lakeside the next morning, a Thursday, not her scheduled day. She arrived at 8. She waited. He came through the door at 8:10 with Penny, and when he saw her positioned in the center of the waiting room, not at her corner, no coffee, just there, with the exact expression she wore at the start of HAR negotiations, he stopped. Penny read the air immediately. "I'm going to sign in," she said, and went to the desk. Holt crossed the room and sat down across from Vera. "Dunbar," she said. A pause. "Yeah. Frank Dunbar's son. Yeah. You've known who I am since the first day." He held her gaze. "Yes." The waiting room was very quiet. 3 months, she said. 3 months. She looked at him, and she felt something that hadn't been entirely grief or pain or the aftermath of the crash. Something rawer, more personal, the particular hurt of having lowered a drawbridge you hadn't opened in a very long time, not knowing there was a reason it had been closed. "Please," she said, and her voice fractured only at the very beginning of the word, only for a half second, the one place she let it out. "Don't hit me. I'm already in pain." He looked at her fully. He didn't look away, and he didn't flinch, and he didn't rush to fill the space with reassurance. "I know," he said quietly. "Then say what you came to say." Her voice steadied again, the way it always did after the one fracture. "If you're here to block the company, or to leverage the claim against the merger, or to make me choose between correcting a 20-year-old wrong and keeping what I built, just say it. I'd rather hear it from you than from a lawyer." Holt leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands loosely folded, the posture of a man who has been carrying something for a long time and has decided it's time to set it down in the right place. 4 months ago, he said, Gil Hartwell's attorney contacted me and offered me $2.3 million to sign away my father's claim before the board meeting. Vera was completely still. 2.3, she repeated, on a claim worth $17 million at activation. He held her gaze steady. I said no. She looked at him. Why? Because 2.3 is the number you offer someone when you need a problem to disappear before someone else finds out it exists. He paused. Hartwell needs that 8% buried before the board votes. Without my father's shares, and with 7 board votes he's already secured, he has just enough to push the Grayfield merger through. With my shares activated and voted against the deal, combined with yours, the acquisition fails. The full architecture of it was assembling itself in Vera's mind with the cold clarity of someone who has spent 20 years reading the true shape of transactions. He's been building this for months, she said, while I was in physical therapy. At least 4 months, from what I can piece together. Possibly longer. She looked at the wall. He saw the wheelchair and decided the building was vacant. She said it not with emotion, but with the flat, grim recognition of someone naming a thing accurately. That's what it looks like to me, Holt said. She was quiet for a long moment. You were never coming for me, she said. You were keeping the thing that was coming for me from having a clean path. He looked at his hands. My father built something with Robert Langston. Whatever Robert did with the buyout structure in 2003, and I'm not here to relitigate that. Those were 2 men making decisions, and one of them is gone. My father never wanted to destroy what they made. He wanted his contribution acknowledged. He wanted it to mean something. He paused. I came here to find out if you were the kind of person who would have done it differently. If you'd known. He looked at her directly. I think you are. The waiting room held them. Down the hall, somewhere past the doors Sandra came through every morning, Penny was doing her session. possibly narrating it, possibly saying behold at an appropriate moment. Vera sat in the center of the room and felt the whole long structure of the last 3 months rearrange itself. Not into something with a hidden agenda, but into something she hadn't had a word for until right now. Someone had been keeping watch, not hovering, not managing, not asking her to be grateful for it, just standing steady and close and making sure the thing moving in the dark didn't get to her before she could see it. "I need to speak to my attorneys," she said. "Of course. And I need everything you have on Hartwell's contact with you from the first call. I can have it to you by tomorrow morning." She looked at the elevator, the same one that had caught her wheel 4 months ago. The same doors. "One more thing," she said. He waited. "Did you intend to tell me?" Eventually, he was quiet. "I was trying to work out how." He turned his coffee cup. "There isn't a version of, by the way, I hold a legal claim against your company that lands easy." "It didn't land easy." "No, you should have told me sooner." "Yes," he said, without wrapping a single excuse around it. "I should have." She nodded. That was what she needed. The plain acknowledgement. Undecorated. "Come to my office tomorrow," she said. "Bring everything." What happened next moved quickly, the way things do when pressure that has been building for months finally finds its outlet. Dale Frick met with Vera's legal team the following Tuesday. The dormant equity clause, reviewed by 3 separate attorneys, was exactly as valid as Frank Dunbar's estate had always claimed. Robert Langston's 2003 buyout structure had been, at best, aggressively constructed and at worst, deliberately designed to suppress a legitimate claim. Vera's attorneys were careful in their language. Vera read the summary alone. She sat with it. Then she called Dale Frick directly. "What would it take," she said, "to honor the clause voluntarily before the board meeting?" There was a pause on the other end. "Mrs. Langston," Frick said slowly, "I've been doing dormant equity work for 19 years, and I have never once had the opposing party call me to ask how to pay." "I'm not the opposing party," she said. "I'm the correcting party. Walk me through the numbers." Honoring the clause meant formally acknowledging the original agreement, issuing Holt Dunbar his 8% equity stake, and documenting the full valuation. Done voluntarily, ahead of litigation, it avoided a public process and protected the company's reputation with institutional investors who did not like the smell of suppressed partner claims. And as a secondary effect, not incidental, but not her only reason for doing it, it changed the board vote entirely. Holt's 8%, combined with Vera's stake, gave her just enough to block the Grayfield acquisition. Just enough. But enough was enough. Gil Hartwell found out 4 days before the board meeting. He called Vera, and she took it on speaker with her general counsel in the room. He spoke for 22 minutes. He used the words prudent stewardship and protecting shareholder value, and you were not in a position to make these decisions at the time. That last one delivered with the particular confidence of someone who had convinced themselves it was generous rather than insulting. She let him finish. "Gil," she said, "I'm going to ask you to submit your resignation before the board convenes. If you choose not to, I will present to the full board the documentation of your 4 months of contact with Holt Dunbar, your settlement offer, and your failure to disclose any of this to me as acting CEO." She paused. "All of it is documented. All of it was retained. A silence that had its own weight." "I have been with this company for 11 years, he said. "I know. You did good work for most of them." She let beat pass. "But you looked at me in that wheelchair and decided the building was up for grabs. I need you to understand it never was." He resigned by 4 o'clock that afternoon. The call ended at 3:22. At 3:47, his resignation letter hit Patricia's inbox, and Patricia forwarded it to Vera with a single word in the subject line: "Done." Vera read it once. It was 3 paragraphs of carefully worded language that attributed the resignation to a desire to pursue other opportunities and said nothing at all about dormant equity clauses or settlement offers or 4 months of quiet maneuvering. Gil Hartwell was many things, but he was not a man who would describe his own defeat in accurate terms. She thought about the years he had worked for this company. The genuine good work in the middle period before he'd looked at an empty wheelchair space at the head of the conference table and decided it meant something it didn't. She thought about the particular kind of ambition that doesn't announce itself as hunger, that wears the clothing of stewardship and prudence right up until the moment it has to drop the costume. She had been managing people long enough to know that Gil Hartwell was not an unusual man. He was not a villain in the theatrical sense. He was an ordinary person who had looked at a situation and made a calculation, and the calculation had been wrong. And now he was writing a careful resignation letter at 4 in the afternoon that would allow both of them to pretend the calculation had never been made. She closed the email. She called the company's head of HR, a capable, no-nonsense woman named Frances Kirby, who had been with Langston Developments for 7 years, and gave her the instructions for transitioning Hartwell's responsibilities cleanly and without public drama. Frances asked 2 clarifying questions, got the answer she needed, and said she would have a transition plan on Vera's desk by 8 the next morning. Vera ended the call and sat for a moment in the quiet of her office, 41 floors above Michigan Avenue, with a resignation letter still open in another window and the city laid out below her in the deep gray of a February evening. She had won. She knew that. But winning felt different from the inside than it looked from the outside. It felt like the aftermath of a long PT session. Not triumph, exactly, but the specific exhaustion and stillness of having held a position that took everything you had. Robert would have come to the office with takeout by now, would have sat on the edge of her desk and said something that put the whole thing in proportion, made it smaller without dismissing it, the way only he could do. She put her hand flat on the desk. She let the office be quiet. Then she picked up her phone and called Patricia and said, "Order something from the Thai place on Huron. Enough for 2. You're staying for dinner." Patricia paused. "Are you?" "I'm fine," Vera said. "I just don't want to eat alone tonight." "That's allowed." "A beat." "Absolutely it is," Patricia said. 30 minutes. Vera set the phone down and looked out at the city and thought about Frank Dunbar's grave and about the word underneath his name and about all the buildings that exist in this world because someone, quietly, without nearly enough acknowledgement, decided to get the foundation right. The board meeting was held on the 23rd of February in the 41st floor conference room with the floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over a gray winter Michigan Avenue. Vera wore a dark blue blazer. Her hair was back. She arrived 5 minutes early and positioned her chair at the head of the table, which was her custom, which she had decided several weeks ago she was going to continue doing regardless of anyone's visual discomfort with the arrangement. The Grayfield proposal was presented by the 3 remaining Hartwell-aligned board members. It was a polished deck. The financial logic was sound on its surface, a premium over current valuation, an exit for shareholders who'd held through volatility. She let them present the whole thing. She had always been good at waiting. Then she spoke. She went through the strategic objections methodically, Grayfield's track record with acquired firms, the employment patterns in their last 4 acquisitions, the South Loop development 90 days from construction milestone that would materially change the company's asset valuation and had been conspicuously omitted from Grayfield's offer model. She was specific. She was calm. She was the CEO of the company she had built, and the board, even the ones who had drifted toward Hartwell's orbit, remembered what that looked like from the inside. Then she introduced the Dunbar Equity Resolution. She explained the history of Frank Dunbar's claim simply and without embellishment. She explained her decision to honor the clause voluntarily. She explained that Holt Dunbar's 8% had been formally issued, acknowledged, and registered. She explained that Mr. Dunbar had indicated his intention to vote against the proposed acquisition. She laid out the vote count. The room held a silence that had a specific quality, the silence of momentum that has been stopped. Roger Foss, one of the Hartwell-aligned members, cleared his throat. The Dunbar equity is fully legally documented, reviewed by 3 separate legal teams, including the company's own, Vera said. The documentation is in front of you. Patrice Rowan, Vera's longest-standing ally on the board, called for the vote with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had been watching a chess game resolve 6 moves in advance. The acquisition failed, and the room, slowly, the way rooms do when a thing that was moving hard in one direction is made to stop, recalibrated around the woman at the head of the table who had just demonstrated from a titanium wheelchair in a dark blue blazer that she had never once stopped running the building. What happened after the vote is not the kind of thing that goes in a press release. 2 days later, Vera called Holt from her car, parked outside the Langston Developments building, because she thought more clearly with a horizon in front of her. "I want to offer you a board seat," she said. A pause. "Vera." Not as a gesture, not as a reconciliation payment. She looked at Michigan Avenue. "Because your father put actual work into what this company is, and because you were a structural engineer who has spent 12 years finding weak foundations before they collapse, and because you said no to $2.3 million from a man who was counting on you to be desperate." She paused. "I need that kind of thinking in that room." He was quiet for a moment. "My father would have." He stopped. "He would have thought that was something." "Think about it," she said. "Tell Penny she can bring her chessboard to the shareholder meeting." A sound that was almost a laugh. "She will absolutely hold you to that." "Good." She ended the call and sat in the car as the city moved past the windows, and she thought about the whole architecture of the last 4 months. The waiting room, the elevator, the powdered sugar on her lapel, the floor of the PT corridor, the specific moment when she'd said, "Please don't hit me," and had meant something so much larger than it sounded, had meant, "I've already lost so much, please don't be another loss." She thought about the decision she'd made, alone in her office after reading the legal summary of Robert's 2003 buyout structuring. The language had been clear enough once you knew what to look for. The dormant clause had not been an accident. It had been a calculation, the same way Gill's settlement offer had been a calculation, a number placed precisely to make something disappear. She had not felt anger at Robert when she read it. She had felt something more complicated than that. Grief mixed with disappointment, mixed with the particular disorienting experience of learning that someone you loved had made a quiet choice you would not have made. She had held the summary for a long time, sitting in the window light, and then she had thought about the 2 most important things she knew about her husband. The first was that he had built something genuinely good and had been proud of it and had wanted it to last. The second was that he had, in his final years, begun to understand the cost of certain decisions he'd made at 35 that he would not have made at 50. She had watched him work his way toward that understanding over years of late conversations and small, incremental admissions that she had not always recognized for what they were. She thought he would have fixed it. Given time, she chose to believe that. She didn't know with certainty. But there are things you choose to believe because the alternative seals too many doors, and Vera Langston had spent too much of the last 6 months in rooms that felt sealed. She thought about pain, not getting to win. She thought about what it cost and what it meant to keep choosing that. 3 weeks later, Penny Dunbar achieved full range of motion in 4 of her 5 right-hand fingers. Sandra marked it on the chart, and then, in a departure from strict protocol that she would defend as therapeutic, high-fived Penny with enough enthusiasm to make a loud sound in the quiet PT room. Penny came into the waiting room afterward and spread her right hand open, all four fingers straight and flat and extended, and held it out in front of Vera's face the way she had done to her father 4 months earlier with a single thumb. "Behold," she said. Vera looked at the hand, the slightly uneven gaps between the knuckles, the fingers that had fought their way back to level, the evidence of a small body that had refused to stop. She spread her own right hand beside Penny's, both hands open, side by side. "Behold," Vera said. Holt, from across the room, looked at the two of them, the 8-year-old in the purple jacket and the CEO in the dark blazer, their open hands side by side in the gray-blue light of the waiting room, and felt something settle in his chest with the particular rightness of a load-bearing structure finally finding its correct distribution. He accepted the board seat 4 days later and told Penny at the kitchen table, over pasta, while she was doing homework, "Is Vera going to be running the meetings?" Penny asked. "She runs everything." Penny considered this. "Good." She turned a page. "She needs to run things. She's good at it." She tilted her head. "She seems like a building from the outside, all strong and nothing gets through. But then you're inside and you see all the work that's holding it up." Holt looked at his daughter for a long moment. "That," he said, "is exactly what she is." He laughed. A full, real one, the kind that fills a kitchen. It had been a while since a laugh like that lived in this room, and it was exactly the right size, and it stayed in the air after the sound was gone. He thought about his father that night, after Penny was asleep, the way he often did in the quiet of the house when there was no noise left to manage. He thought about what Frank would have made of all of it. The waiting room, the dormant clause finally honored, his son sitting on the board of the company that had carried his fingerprints invisibly for 20 years. Frank had not been a man who wanted monuments. He'd been a man who wanted the record to be accurate, who believed that the truth of how something was built mattered as much as what got built. You could not, in Frank Dunbar's philosophy, build anything lasting on a foundation that had been falsified. The weight would find the lie eventually. It always did. Holt sat at the kitchen table with the pasta dishes still out and thought it found it. Not in the way Frank might have imagined. Not through litigation or public exposure or the grinding machinery of a legal fight. It had found it through a PT waiting room, and a little girl with a magnetic chessboard, and two people who had circled each other carefully for 3 months until the truth was the only thing left to say. He thought that was probably the way it should work. Not with force, with patience and the willingness to be in the room long enough for things to become clear. He washed the dishes. He checked on Penny. She was asleep with the lights on and a book open across her chest, which was her constant state. He turned off the light. He stood in the hallway outside her door for a moment. The pain doesn't get to win. He thought she was right about that. He thought she had been right about it for a long time. The following April, Vera Langston went to the South Loop development site on a Thursday morning, early before the crew arrived. Robert's project, the one he brought blueprints for to their last dinner, talking about it with his hands the way he always did when he was most excited about something, drawing in the air. The project that had been on hold, quietly preserved for 6 months while the company survived everything that had tried to end it. The lot was cleared and staked. The outline of the building was visible only as intent, lines in the ground that said something is going to be here, something that lasts. Vera sat at the edge of the lot in the April cold and looked at the empty space. She thought, Robert would have stood here and told me what he saw. He always did that, stood in empty lots and described the finished building as if it already existed, as if he were a person who could simply see through time. She had always half listened, impatient to get to the meeting, the numbers, the next thing. She listened now. She sat in the cool morning air and let herself hear the version of him that lived in the place grief hadn't reached, and she heard the building. What it would look like from the street. What the lobby would feel like when you walked in. How the light would come through the south-facing glass in winter. She stayed for 40 minutes. She was late for PT, which Sandra noted professionally and without warmth. I was held up, Vera said. Sandra looked at the left wheel of the titanium chair. There's concrete dust on your wheel. Vera looked down. There was in fact a fine gray powder on the rim. I went to the South Loop site, she said. How was it? Vera thought about the empty lot and the lines in the ground and the sound of a man she loved describing a building into morning air. Solid, she said. The foundation's solid. And she meant it in every way it could possibly be meant. The last thing worth telling happened on a Saturday in May when the lake was the specific, brilliant blue that only a Chicago spring can produce. The color that makes everyone who survived the winter feel briefly and entirely justified. Vera went to Rose Hill Cemetery. She went to Robert first. She stayed 20 minutes. She said the things that belong to private grief in the particular language of people who are still arguing with someone who is no longer there to argue back. And she did not perform composure for anyone because there was no one to perform it for. Then she navigated the path. She knew it by heart now. Third row past the oak, left at the limestone bench to a different section of the grounds. Frank Dunbar's headstone. Plain, clean. The one word below the dates that Frank had chosen himself. Builder. She sat in front of it for a moment with her hands in her lap. I didn't know you, she said. I should have. I think Robert should have made sure I did. She paused. What you built together, the real thing, the foundation of it, is still standing. I'm going to make sure it keeps standing. She put her hand against the cold stone, held it there. Your son, she said, is going to be in that boardroom. Because he thinks like you did. He looks at what's underneath things. She paused. And your granddaughter says behold when she means it. Which I think you would have appreciated. She stayed until the wind off the lake picked up, and then she turned her chair and made her way back down the cemetery path, back toward the parking lot where Patricia was waiting, back toward the board and the South Loop Foundation being poured the following week, back toward the full, complicated, still being built life that was hers. She did not think of herself as brave for any of this. She thought of it as the only available option. But here is what she had learned in a gray-blue waiting room in a PT center on the near north side, from a man who looked at broken foundations for a living and a little girl who said behold when she meant it. The only available option and the bravest thing are sometimes exactly the same. The pain did not get to win. You can build on that. If this one sat with you, share it with someone who's been in a waiting room lately, holding something heavy, hoping someone will just sit on the floor beside them for a while. Like and subscribe to Crest Stories for more real-life narratives like this one. We'll be here